Okay, so the very last thing we're going to talk about in this unit, which is unit 3.4, so this is the end part of unit 3.4, it's what's called nuclear reactions. And this is a little bit different than everything else we've talked about so far, because we've been talking about chemical reactions, and a nuclear reaction is completely different than a chemical reaction. Okay, and so chemical reactions happen when you mix chemicals together, and chemical reactions have to do with atoms bonding together and exchanges of electrons and valence electrons and all that stuff. And nuclear reactions have nothing to do with electrons. And in fact, the word nuclear means having to do with the nucleus of an atom. Okay, so anytime you hear nuclear, that means having to do with the nucleus. Now, what is the nucleus? Well, we've talked about this before in past units, but just to kind of refresh your memory, when you talk about an atom, you basically have two main parts. You have the small, tiny, dense middle of the atom with the protons and the neutrons, and that's called the nucleus. And then on the outside, you have the electrons. Okay, so this is where the electrons live in their shells on the outside. And so we've been mainly focused on those electrons and the valence electrons and how those are involved in chemical reactions and chemical bonds and all that stuff. But a nuclear reaction has to do with the nucleus of an atom. Okay, and again, that's basically the really, really small, tiny center of the atom that has protons and neutrons, and most of the atom's mass is actually inside that nucleus. And just to show you how small the atom is and how small the nucleus is, I'm going to put in a video here that talks about how small those things are. Okay, so check out that video and answer some questions about the video. Okay, so again, we're kind of mixing it up here, talking about nuclear reactions rather than chemical reactions. And we're going to focus on two main types of nuclear reactions. And the first type of nuclear reaction we're going to talk about is what's called nuclear fission. Okay, not to be confused with fusion that we will talk about later. Okay, so nuclear fission has a specific definition. And basically, nuclear fission is the process of splitting a nucleus. And this word is missing in the notes, but I'm going to put in the word big. Splitting a big nucleus into two or more smaller nuclei. Now, this word nuclei is basically just the plural of nucleus. Okay, so if you have one nucleus, if you had more than one nucleus, then you would call that nuclei. Okay, so fission involves taking a big nucleus and then splitting it into smaller nuclei. Now, how does that happen? Well, in simple terms, the nucleus is really, really, really big and massive and it has protons and neutrons. And when you go higher up the periodic table, it gets even more big and more massive. And so you can imagine as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's kind of like a water balloon that gets filled up with water. And we all know that if you fill up a water balloon too much, then it pops. And so if you get a big enough nucleus, then you can essentially pop it. And when you pop it, it basically splits into two pieces. And the way you pop a nucleus with nuclear fission is not with like a needle or something, but it's actually with a neutron. And so in the notes, it talks about how fission can be achieved by bombarding the nucleus with neutrons. If you don't know what that word bombarding means, that basically means hitting or shooting. And so if we take a really big nucleus and we hit it with neutrons, then we can possibly cause that nucleus to pop or to split or to undergo fission. And then what happens is when it splits, you get a couple different products. Okay, and so first of all, you get two smaller nuclei. And so what we're looking at here is basically we start off with what's called a uranium-235 nucleus, and we hit it with a neutron, and then that's going to turn into uranium-236, okay, which is like right before it pops, right before it undergoes fission. And afterwards, you basically end up with these products. We have two smaller pieces, and then this is a key right here to nuclear fission. One of the products that you get from fission is extra neutrons. Okay, and that is key to what we're talking about here in a minute, which is having to do with chain reactions. Okay, and so not only does a neutron cause fission to happen, but neutrons are also produced during fission. Not to mention, of course, a lot of energy is also released during fission. Okay, so nuclear fission, when you talk about like nuclear bombs, nuclear power plants, those typically use nuclear fission, okay, which is what we're talking about now. And so those obviously involve like a lot of energy. And so when this reaction happens, again, this is not a chemical reaction, but this is a nuclear reaction. When this reaction happens, it releases a ton of energy. And so the energy is really nice, but those extra neutrons that come out are essential for what's called a chain reaction. And basically, the simplified version of what a chain reaction is in this context is remember that what started off the fission here was a neutron. And so what could happen is remember that we actually produce extra neutrons in fission. And so it's also possible that those neutrons that come out could go on to cause more fissions. Okay, and so you could have one neutron and it causes fission, and then you get, let's say, three neutrons, and those three neutrons cause fission, and then you get nine neutrons, and those neutrons cause fission, and you get this like exponential growth of reactions, and all this energy is produced really, really quickly, and you get like a lot of heat, and you basically get like a nuclear bomb, is what I'm describing. Okay, so that's how nuclear fission works. So pause there if you need to look at that some more. Okay, so what you're looking at here is basically like the chain reaction that I just described. Um, and so what it says in the notes is that when a nuclear fission reaction occurs, the neutrons emitted, this word emitted, if you don't know what that means released. The neutrons that are released in the reaction can strike other nuclei and cause them to split. And when it says cause them to split, of course, we're talking about fission. Because when you split a nucleus, what you're talking about is fission. Some people you might have heard of like splitting the atom. We can't really split atoms, but we can split the nucleus of the atom, which is like the small center in the middle. Okay, and so what you're seeing here in this picture is basically that chain reaction that I just described. You split a nucleus through fission, and then that reaction produces more neutrons, and those neutrons can hit other nuclei and cause more fission and make more neutrons, and you get this like chain reaction that I'm describing. Okay, so you get a big release of energy very, very, very quickly. Okay, so pause there if you need to look at that some more. Now, if you get what's called an uncontrolled chain reaction, then basically you get what is referred to as a nuclear bomb, which most people know what a nuclear bomb is. It's a really big bomb. Most bombs use like chemicals for the explosion. A nuclear bomb uses fission. And basically the chain reaction happens just like I just described, where you get like more and more and more and more neutrons. And so the reaction happens faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And it happens so quickly that all that energy is released in a giant explosion. Okay, and so if you have this uncontrolled chain reaction, you have an enormous amount of energy released um, from the fission. Now, it is possible to actually control the chain reaction. And in a controlled chain reaction, you basically make it so that the energy does not increase at a fast rate, but basically remains constant. It remains steady. And we're not really going to talk about like how they do that in a nuclear power plant, but this is basically how a nuclear power plant works. And so you still have a chain reaction in a nuclear power plant, but rather than getting like bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it basically they make it so that it stays like the same and it stays controlled. That's why it's called a controlled chain reaction. And one way they do that is by adding materials into the nuclear reactor that absorb those extra neutrons so that they don't cause a bigger chain reaction. And again, I'm really like simplifying how a nuclear power plant works. But that's basically the difference between a nuclear power plant and a nuclear bomb. One has a controlled chain reaction and the other has an uncontrolled chain reaction. Okay, so pause it there if you need to look at that some more. Okay, so quick example. Which of the following best describes nuclear fission? Okay, and so we only have three answer choices, A, B, and C, and so pause it here and try to answer this question on your own. Okay, so nuclear fission, the correct answer to this question is B. A is actually what is referred to as nuclear fusion, which is what we're about to talk about in a minute. And then C, well, C just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so the answer there should be B. All right, now let's talk about nuclear fusion. Okay, so fusion is kind of like the opposite of fission. So with fission, you have like a really, really, really big nucleus, and you basically pop it with a neutron. With fusion, you start off with really, really small nuclei, and you fuse them, you combine them, you stick them together to form a bigger nucleus. Okay, so rather than taking a big nucleus and breaking it into small pieces, like you have with fusion, you're taking two small pieces and making them into a bigger piece. And typically, when we talk about nuclear fusion, the smaller nuclei that we're talking about are hydrogen atoms. Okay, and so usually what you do is you take hydrogen atoms and you somehow get them to stick together. And when hydrogen sticks together, it actually forms helium. And not only do you get helium, but you also get a lot of energy. And when I say a lot of energy, um, before we talked about nuclear fission, which is obviously like an enormous amount of energy because you have nuclear power plants, you have nuclear bombs, which are giant explosions. Nuclear fusion releases way more energy than even fission. And so this is like a massive amount of energy. You might have heard of nuclear bombs before. If you've ever heard of a hydrogen bomb, okay, hydrogen bombs are like the most powerful weapons on Earth. Okay, these are basically bombs that use, instead of using nuclear fission, they use nuclear fusion. Okay, so if you've ever heard of like hydrogen bombs or H bombs, they're basically like a nuclear bomb that uses fission, except way, way, way more powerful than even that. Okay, so you can get way more energy from fusion than we can from fission. Okay, so this slide right here is basically just showing you the difference between fission and fusion. Make sure you can understand the difference between those two things. Okay, and then this is just like a visualization of the same basic thing. Okay, now the most important fusion in the universe actually happens in stars, like our sun. Okay, and so our sun is very hot and very bright. And a lot of people might have seen pictures of our sun and thought like it was on fire. But guys, the sun is not on fire. Fire comes from a chemical reaction called combustion, and that involves oxygen. And there's no oxygen in space, right? It's just space. And so the reason our sun is really, really big and really, really hot is not because it's on fire. All that heat and energy actually comes from fusion. Okay, and so inside the sun, at every second, you have nuclear fusion happening, and that's what makes it so hot and bright. Okay, not just our sun, but every star in the universe, when you look up at the sky at night, all of those stars, well, actually not all of them, I guess some of them are dead, some of them might be white dwarfs, but most of the stars that are still alive in the universe, they produce their energy from fusion. Okay, so fusion is actually one of the most common nuclear reactions in the universe. Okay, and so we're not going to get super detailed about how fusion works. But basically, in order to get fusion to work, you want to take two small nuclei and you want to get them really close together so that they stick. And the problem with that is they don't really want to do that. Okay, so if you have hydrogen and you try to get it close to hydrogen, they actually repel each other and they don't want to stick. And the only way to make them stick is if you have super, super, super high temperatures, like millions of degrees. Okay, so if you take the hydrogen and you heat it up to like millions of degrees, then you can get the nuclei moving fast enough to get fusion to happen. Okay, and so actually nuclear fusion is really hard to do on Earth. We're trying to do it on Earth, and it's hard for us to do because the temperatures are super high, and it's really hard to like contain something that's millions of degrees in temperature. But we are trying because we want to find a way to produce energy from that, and we haven't really figured out how to do that yet. The other really cool thing about hydrogen, sorry, not hydrogen, fusion, the other amazing thing about fusion that a lot of people don't know about, is that every atom on the periodic table, okay, all of them, except for hydrogen, the reason it exists is because of fusion. And so when the universe was formed, the only element, or I should say, the first elements that were formed is hydrogen. And the reason is that hydrogen is basically just like one proton. It's like super, super simple. One proton, one electron, nothing to it. Every other element, from helium to lithium to carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, every other element came from fusing hydrogen and other elements together. Okay, and so our bodies are made of, water is H2O, so we have oxygen, we have nitrogen, we have carbon, we have all these elements like in our bodies. We basically came from fusion, okay, which I always thought was like really cool. Which remember, fusion happens inside stars, and so you are basically made of stardust because all of the elements inside of your body besides hydrogen came from inside stars, or they could have come from supernova also, but they still came from stars and fusion. Okay, so nuclear fusion is basically why you even exist. Okay, and then this slide basically just talks about how most of the energy given off by the sun is produced by nuclear fusion of hydrogen. We talked about that before. And then a large amount of nuclear energy is transformed into heat, which, of course, everyone knows that the sun is really hot. That's because fusion produces a lot of heat. No surprise there. Okay, so quick example. Which of the following types of nuclear reactions is involved in a nuclear power plant? Fission or fusion? Okay, so the correct answer here is A. Most of actually all of our nuclear power plants use nuclear fission. And it's not that we don't want nuclear fusion power plants, it's just that we've not yet figured out how to do it. And so that's something that scientists are still working on, but they would really like to be able to do that because it releases more energy than fission, and it's actually safer as well. Okay, second example. Which of the following types of nuclear reactions is involved in the sun? Okay, so remember the sun is mostly made of hydrogen, and hydrogen, the nuclear reaction involving hydrogen is fusion. You're fusing the small hydrogen atoms, sorry, the small hydrogen nuclei into a bigger nucleus like helium. That is textbook fusion. And then the last question, which of the following types of nuclear reactions is involved in forming elements heavier than hydrogen? Okay, so try to answer that question on your own. Okay, so we talked about this a few slides back. Fusion is responsible for forming all of the elements heavier than hydrogen, including the elements in your body and including the elements in the Earth. Okay, so every single element on the periodic table besides hydrogen was formed through nuclear fusion. And the very last two slides are basically just talking about how you can use nuclear reactions in medicine. And so one way you can do that is using what's called a radioactive isotope as a tracer. And what you can do is if you're sick or something, then the doctors can inject this tracer into your body, into your bloodstream, or into like, different parts of your body. And basically these radioactive isotopes emit radiation. And the doctors can track that radiation, and by tracking the radiation, they can basically figure out like how things are flowing inside your body, and they can figure out how your organs are functioning. Um, and so, some of you might have experienced that before. You might have known people that experienced radioactive tracers. Usually, it's used for like diagnosing, um, illnesses or stuff like that. Okay, so that's one example of how you could use nuclear radiation in medicine. And then the very last slide is just talking about cancer treatment. When a person has cancer, basically cancer is when you have a group of cells in your body that like it keeps growing out of control, and that can cause issues. In multiple different ways. But basically, you have an uncontrolled growth of cells in the body, and so sometimes they can do like chemotherapy, which is where you have like chemicals trying to attack the cancer cells. But you can also use what's called radiation therapy, where basically they put something radioactive next to the tumor that's like the group of cells that's out of control. And the goal is to use the radioactive source to kill the cancer cells. At least that is the goal. Okay, and so in the notes it says the goal in such a procedure is to damage the tumor as much as possible while minimizing damage to surrounding tissue. And that last part, while minimizing damage to surrounding tissue, that's not always possible, which is one reason why people, if they have cancer, if they get radiation therapy, it can actually cause them to feel like really sick or, cause other health issues besides the cancer because even though they're doing it to kill the cancer cells, it's still not good for the body to have like something radioactive inside of you. Okay, so those are just some different types of nuclear reactions. We talked about fission, we talked about fusion, and then we talked about how some other nuclear things can be used in medicine. All right, so as always, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next video.